How old do you think this rock is?
I am more interested in the rock of ages than I am in the age of rocks.
Alfred Russel Wallace.
This is the Runners Up Club, a podcast about unsung heroes, lovable losers, and forgotten failures. For those with a few minutes to spend on those who spent theirs in a losing cause.
Hey folks, welcome to the Runners Up Club. I'm Ray Gustinelli here with a tale that will rock your world. And that's true, I hope, regardless of whether you are more interested in the Rock of Ages or the Age of Rocks. We're here to talk about the naturalist and explorer Alfred Russel Wallace, the man who co-discovered the theory of evolution by natural selection. That's the awesome man from monkeys theory, which us modern folk all know in our science brains to be true, and for which Charles Darwin gets the lion's share of the credit. Lions, by the way, evolved from lion-like cats in East Africa during the Pliocene era a couple million years ago. But we're not here to talk about lions, we're here to talk about monkeys and God. Here's the tale of the tape. Darwin's in the top 10 of greatest scientists of all time. On the Origin of the Species is considered one of the most influential books in history, the most influential academic book according to a 2015 survey that had Isaac Newton's Principia second. Taking the measure of Wallace's fame, or lack thereof, there are tons of metrics we can use. For some reason, I seem drawn to the prominence of statuary in these things. It's a physical representation of esteem, one meant to declare for future generations, us, the importance of this guy, usually a guy. So on the bust measure, Wallace is a bust. There are over 20 major statues honoring Darwin, about 5 for Wallace. And that's if you're counting the marble medallion at Westminster Abbey that sits a few feet away from the life-size bust of Charles Darwin, which sits above his actual grave. Wallace was a pallbearer for Darwin, actually helped transport his body to the distinguished resting place there beside Isaac Newton that he, Wallace, by our measure, should be sharing, but is not. He's buried in Dorset. So let's talk about Wallace. He was a contemporary of Darwin's, 14 years his junior. Notably, he was not born into Darwin's world of country estates and Cambridge connections. He was the 8th of 9 children in a middle-class Welsh family who couldn't afford to keep him in school past age 14. So he became a surveyor, then a teacher, all the while devouring books from mechanics institutes and lending libraries. Fast forward to 1844. Wallace is working as a teacher in Leicester, England, age 21, hanging at the local library when he meets one Henry William Bates, a total beetle nerd who at age 19 had already published a scientific paper on insects in the Zoologist journal. Bates gets Wallace into bugs. The spark of passion is lit. Wallace consumes 3 books that would set his life's path. Robert Chambers' Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, Darwin's The Voyage of the Beagle, and William Henry Edwards' A Voyage Up the River Amazon. That last one inspires Wallace to get out of Leicester. "Come on, Henry," he says to Bates, "let's go collect us some bugs." They do. It's 1848 now. Wallace, age 25, and Bates sail from Liverpool to Brazil. Wallace spends 4 years there in the Amazon River basin, amassing a huge collection of exotic species: butterflies, beetles, birds, monkeys, rats, lizards, snakes, frogs, and working out his thoughts on what was there and how they got there and why. He'd been sending back those specimens in stages over those years. Indeed, the buyers for those, other naturalists and museums and the like, were what subsidized his mission. On his return to England in 1852, tragedy strikes. A fire breaks out on the ship, a not uncommon occurrence in those days of wooden hulls and ship tar and lantern light. The crew spend 10 days on a dinghy waiting to be rescued. What Wallace felt watching thousands of specimens, irreplaceable notes, sketches of species no European had ever documented, turn to ash and sink into the sea, we can only guess. What we know is that he was undaunted. Within 2 years, he's off again, this time to the Malay archipelago, present-day Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. This expedition would last 8 years, from 1854 to 62. He travels over 14,000 miles, collects over 125,000 specimens, including over 1,000 species new to science at the time. It was on this expedition that Wallace made an observation that still bears his name, the Wallace Line, it's called. It's a faunal boundary running between Bali and Lombok, separating Asian and Australian wildlife. On one side, tigers, rhinoceroses, monkeys. On the other, marsupials, cockatoos, honey-eaters. The islands are only 20 miles apart, but evolutionarily, they are as if different worlds. Speaking of evolution, Wallace had been refining his thoughts on what was then known as the transmutation of species for many years. Early in his trip, 1855, he published a paper arguing that every species had come into existence coincident, both in time and space, with pre-existing closely allied species. In other words, species don't just pop into existence independently in the places they happen to be found. This was by no means a full-blown evolutionary theory, but it was an important precursor. Now, Wallace was an occasional correspondent with Darwin at this time, who regarded him as a peer and fellow traveler along the more radical byways of their field. Of course, while Wallace was traipsing through the jungle, Darwin was living the life of a gentleman scientist at his country estate in Kent. He's breeding pigeons, taking long country walks, writing. All very methodical. That was the Darwin way. Darwin read Wallace's 1855 paper. Darwin took notes on that paper. Now, granted, it was in no way the full and formal elucidation of ideas that would have constituted a discovery. Wallace's paper a few years later, in 1858, inarguably was. The story goes that he had a flash of insight during a fever dream out there in the Malay jungle, Wallace tossing in night sweats, beset by thoughts of the species' struggle for existence in the face of unchecked Malthusian population growth. The story is true, the fever dream did occur, but as we've seen, Wallace had been thinking about these ideas for years. The paper was called On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type, a wonderfully stodgy title for a world-shaking idea. It certainly shook Darwin's world when Wallace sent it to him. We picture the moment. It's June 18th, 1858. Darwin is alone in his study in Kent. He's just been handed the morning mail. On top, a thick envelope from that Welsh surveyor dude, Wallace, postmarked Ternate, a tiny island in the Moluccas, aka the Spice Islands. At this point, Darwin's got a few hundred pages of On the Origin of the Species complete. He's been writing steadily for decades, but he's got a ways to go before it's suitable for publication. Years more writing at his glacial pace. Darwin unfolds Wallace's paper. It's about 5,000 words. Would have taken Darwin about 10 minutes to read. Another 15 as he reads through a second time, in mounting horror as he realizes he is about to be forestalled. That's the fancy Victorian-era scientific term for beaten to the punch. Now, to Darwin's credit, he was not inclined to rush his own work to publication. He wasn't going to try to pretend that Wallace hadn't truly independently developed out the theory of evolution. Darwin's buds in the scientific establishment, however, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, were less forgiving. They've been watching Darwin develop these ideas for decades, helping him do so, and they are not about to let him lose out at the last minute just because he was taking his sweet time getting everything down on paper. Lyell and Hooker get a date on the calendar of the Linnaean Society, then as now a premier association of natural history scholars. They package Wallace's paper with extracts from previous work and letters from Darwin. It's considered a joint presentation before the Society. Darwin and Wallace both credited Wallace for the elegance and concision of his argument, but priority for the ideas is clearly given to Darwin. Ironically, neither Darwin nor Wallace was present at this meeting. Darwin, at this point, was grief-stricken, having just buried his infant son Charles, who died a few days before of scarlet fever. Wallace, of course, was out in the jungle. He had no idea this was even happening. The presentation wasn't well attended. It was the last one before summer break, and the papers had only been submitted the morning of the meeting. This was a rush job, an event orchestrated by Lyell and Hooker with the express intention of establishing Darwin's priority in the discovery of evolution. Well, it worked. It bought Darwin time to complete his writing. It wasn't until the full publication of On the Origin of Species, 15 months later, that the concepts of natural selection, evolution, and the radical implications of a men from monkeys hypothesis would expand into the broader public sphere, spurring much furrowing of brows and wringing of hands. Wallace didn't return to England until 1862, 4 years after the publication of the joint article and 3 years after the publication of Darwin's magnum opus. He arrived to find himself quite famous, a star in the firmament of natural historians, but Darwin, meanwhile, had gone supernova. His was the name associated with evolution. To his credit, or perhaps we should say to his discredit, Wallace was a vocal defender of Darwin who never begrudged him his fame nor challenged his claims to priority. In fact, Wallace went out of his way to minimize his own contributions. He titled his 1889 book Darwinism, and he actively promoted Darwin's primacy. Today, the Darwin-Wallace paper of 1858, that's the one presented to the Linnaean Society, is considered the first publication explaining the phenomenon of evolution by natural selection, and as such, it's generally seen to establish unequivocally Wallace as a co-discoverer. That's all well and good, but as we've already seen, by the measure of the bust and many other measures, Wallace is, if not the forgotten man, then surely the junior partner, the asterisk, the other guy. How come? Was Wallace too modest? Should he have asserted his primacy more strenuously? Was it a function of his absence? He was still out catching bugs, wading through leech-infested rivers in a sweat-soaked linen field shirt, while Darwin was hobnobbing with his peers in a black dress coat and a cravat, surrounded by a growing posse of champions, not just Lyell and Hooker, but the influential botanist Thomas Huxley, Aldous' grandfather, who became known as Darwin's bulldog for taking the battle for evolution directly to the Anglican establishment. If Wallace had been in England, if Wallace had had a posse, let alone a bulldog, would Darwin and Wallace roll off the tongue the way Watson and Crick now do? Maybe. I actually don't think so. For me, this is where God comes in. Well, not God, lowercase God. Spirit, intelligence, something bigger, unknown, unknowable. There were several fairly minor differences between what might have been called Wallaceism and Darwinism, but this was the big one. In the years after the coming out parties, Wallace had become convinced that natural selection alone seemed insufficient to explain human consciousness, morality, mathematical ability, artistic creativity, spiritual yearning. Why would natural selection produce brains capable of calculus in people who lived in Stone Age conditions? Why would evolution create appreciation for symphony and sculpture in species that needed only to survive and reproduce? Unlike Darwin, Wallace believed that there was a teleological quality to evolution, that it had a design and a direction. Natural selection explains the body beautifully, Wallace argued, but something else must account for the mind. In the 1860s, Wallace got heavily involved with phrenology and mesmerism, and through his sister became introduced to spiritualism. Now, all this sort of stuff, reading bumps on the head, hypnotism, seances, were considered full-on hocus pocus to the serious adult scientists in the room, then as now. And you can see where this would put him at odds with the emerging consensus rational materialist view of evolution. If Newton's Principia could be considered the starting pistol on mankind's headlong race away from God, then On the Origin of the Species represented its glorious finish, as a now thoroughly modern man breaks the tape on an enlightened rationalism, his arms thrust triumphantly upward toward an empty, soulless cosmos. Those two books, recall, ranked 1 and 2 in the recent poll of history's most influential books. But lo, it turns out that Wallace was indeed as interested in the Rock of Ages as he was the Age of Rocks. He called it his little heresy at first, recognizing that it was kind of hard to square the spirit and the material. Darwin wrote him, "I hope you have not murdered too completely your own and my child." He didn't murder it. In fact, Wallace was sort of laughed out of the room the way most other spiritualists were, even the scientifically minded ones like Arthur Conan Doyle, inventor of that most famous fictional rationalist, Sherlock Holmes, irony alert, and William Crookes, a famous chemist and physicist. No surprise here. I suppose there was a lot of hoaxing going on, and it was hard, then as now, to distinguish between a shenanigan and a phenomenon. The poobahs in the scientific establishment did not have genuine first-hand experience with phenomena they cannot explain. Skeptics gonna skept. But Wallace did have such experiences. Here's a snip from a letter he sent to Professor of Physics and Chemistry William Barrett in June of 1871.
I have lately had a séance with the celebrated Mr. Home, and saw that most wonderful phenomenon, an accordion, playing beautiful music by itself, the bottom only being held in Mr. Home's hand. I was invited to watch it as closely as I pleased under the table in a well-lighted room. I'm sure nothing touched it but Mr. Home's one hand, yet at one time I saw a shadowy yet defined hand on the keys. This is too vast a phenomenon for any skeptic to assimilate, and I can well understand the impossibility of their accepting the evidence of their own senses.
Okay, I get it. The keys playing themselves, not impressive. Could be a player piano sort of thing. But seeing a shadowy hand on the keys? Look through Wallace's writings, as I have done, and there's more first-hand accounts. In one, a young girl medium is locked in a cabinet, bound hand and foot. A face appears in the aperture of the cabinet, indistinct. Then a different face emerges, someone with a turban-like headdress. It's easy to make fun of this stuff nowadays. It's easy for us, at 160-year remove, to doubt what it was that Wallace saw, but we cannot and should not doubt that he saw it. I don't know about you, but when one of history's greatest scientists says he saw a ghost, I'm inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's earned it! Okay, let's sum up. Wallace was a field man, a man of the world, a man in the world. Not an academic, not purely a theoretician, although he was a very good theoretician. He bore witness to what he saw with his eyes, whether in the jungles of Southeast Asia or a drawing room in Victorian London. And he drew the most natural conclusions from what he saw. Now that's a scientist. Here at the Runners Up Club, we like to put a little bookmark for posterity on our distinguished inductees whose society may yet yank from our ranks. My money's on Wallace being one of those. We shall see. The old Enlightenment may have reached its climax with Darwinism, but a new Enlightenment, more in line with the Buddhist conception of the term, may yet emerge, with Wallaceism at its center. I may be long gone when that happens, maybe you too, but if it does, I'll be sure the digital stewards tending our club in years hence will remember to take Wallace's frame down from the portrait gallery, which sits just outside the Great Hall, where we have our annual banquets here at the Runners Up Club. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'll see you next time.
This podcast is created, written, and performed by Ray Augustinelli, and produced by, with original music by, Bad Hat Media. Find more at runnersupclub.com. Until next time, keep running.
It isn't enough that everybody who comes into this courtroom has to pass under a sign which says, "Read your Bible." I want that sign taken down, Your Honor. No! Or else I want another sign put up, just as big, with just as big letters, which says, "Read your Darwin."
By all means do, but read your Wallace, too.